Welcome to The Debate. Today we're confronting a deeply uncomfortable truth about modern Britain. We're drawing on an exclusive investigation, really powerful research that sort of peels back the layers on any illusion of a post-racial society. It reveals what seems to be an escalating crisis of discrimination, touching pretty much every aspect of daily life for millions. It's sobering stuff, and we really want to thank Expert Trader UK for their groundbreaking research here. It shines such a vital light on this subject.
Absolutely. Vital work.
So our central question for this discussion is, well, it's critical. When we look at the UK's racism crisis, right now in 2025, is it primarily driven by active, deliberate, systemic discrimination? Systems actively designed or, perhaps more crucially, consciously maintained to perpetuate racial hierarchy?
Or is it more a product of deep-seated institutional failures, things like historical biases that just continue almost by inertia to perpetuate unequal outcomes, even when there are stated commitments to equality?
Exactly. And I'll be arguing that the evidence, when you look closely, strongly points towards an active, deliberate, systemic issue.
And I'll be presenting the perspective that while the impact is undeniably devastating, and yes, systemic, the core character of this crisis stems more from these pervasive institutional failures and those historical biases that just persistently go unaddressed. It's a really important distinction, I think. And yeah, I'm ready to unpack it.
Okay, so my perspective is that the evidence in the source material, it paints a really stark picture. Racism in the UK today isn't just some, lingering bias left over from the past. It feels active. It feels like it's growing, and it seems demonstrably, deliberately entrenched as a system. Consciously maintained, perhaps to keep that racial hierarchy in place. It's not passive. It feels proactive in the harm it causes. Just consider the sheer scale. You've got 83% of British adults believing racism exists, and more than half of 18 to 24-year-olds believe there's a great deal of it. This isn't some, fringe issue. It's widely acknowledged across society.
Mm-hmm. And the numbers on hate crimes, they are particularly alarming. They really reveal a pattern, I think, of targeted persecution. In 2024, police recorded over 140,000 hate incidents. A staggering 70% of those were race-motivated crimes.
70%, wow.
Yeah. And here's the critical disproportionality. Ethnic minorities make up less than 20% of the population, right? But they account for over 69% of hate crime victims. And digging deeper, Black Britons, just 4% of the population, face 23.1% of all hate incidents. That level of disparity, it screams of targeting, doesn't it? It suggests a system allowing, maybe even actively facilitating this harm. And this sort of deliberate nature extends into how institutions operate. The source highlights this concept of automated racism through predictive policing systems. Now, these are used by 3/4 of UK police forces.
Right, the algorithmic bias.
Exactly. These tools, they're built on historically biased data. We know that. But they don't just reflect past racism. The research says they supercharge it. They actively target communities of color for increased surveillance. So for instance, Black people are stopped and searched over 4 times more than white people in London. And get this. During just 3 months of the 2020 lockdown, the Met Police conducted over 20,000 searches of Black young men aged 15-24. That's like searching a quarter, 25% of London's entire young Black male population in that age group. This isn't just an accident of history. It feels like the active, conscious application of biased tools that will lead to discriminatory outcomes. And then there's the government's response, or lack thereof. The 2024 race riots, for example, they were largely treated as violent disorder, weren't they? Rather than being fully acknowledged as instances of racist terrorism. Courts often fail to recognize that full racial dimension. And the Race Equality Foundation explicitly warns that the conditions that led to the riots remain unchanged and unchallenged. Now, that sounds like a deliberate failure to address and dismantle systemic racism. And by failing to act, you allow it not just to persist, but actually to strengthen, to become more embedded.
Okay, I approach this from a slightly different angle. While I absolutely agree with you on the severity, the undeniable, widespread nature of racism in the UK, the evidence is overwhelming. The source material, in many instances, seems to point to situations that stem more from these deep-seated institutional failures and inherited historical biases, rather than perhaps a pervasive, deliberate act of intent to discriminate in every single instance today. These are systems that perpetuate inequality, often due to inertia, a lack of critical self-assessment, unaddressed legacies that have just been allowed to keep operating. The outcomes are horrific, I absolutely agree, but the intent behind every single action or inaction isn't always necessarily one of malicious conscious design today. Let's look at housing discrimination, for instance. The research is groundbreaking here. It reveals Black families are less than half as likely to secure permanent housing compared to their white counterparts. Only 10% of Black families gain social housing compared to 24% of white families.
Right.
Now, is this necessarily a new policy explicitly stating don't house Black families? Or does it represent a systemic failure to provide equitable access? Probably arguably a legacy of past inequalities combined with just insufficient mechanisms to actively overcome them now. And the testimonials reflect this, don't they? They're deeply disturbing. Individuals forced to hide their identity, using 21 names, as one participant said, just to navigate a biased system. Or the sister changing her name, practicing a proper English accent. These are desperate measures people take because the system is unfair and fails to protect them, rather than it being actively designed today to persecute on every single interaction. In the professional world, we see a similar pattern, I think. 69% of ethnic minorities report workplace discrimination. That rises to 76% for Black, Caribbean, and African workers. Bria, the NHS specialist mentioned in the research, she recounts her thoughts being dismissed, especially by older white men and women.
Yeah, that was striking.
It really was. And when she reported incidents, she was labeled a troublemaker. And critically, she says nothing ever happens. Now, I don't think this is a deliberate design to make ethnic minorities into troublemakers. It feels more like a profound failure of organizational culture, a failure of HR systems to actually address existing biases, to protect employees and ensure equity. The system breaks down through inaction, through a lack of robust processes, a lack of accountability, and that allows individual prejudices just to flourish. And even in healthcare, where the stakes are literally life and death, this deep-seated discrimination is evident, often rooted in those historical biases. Here are all experienced microaggressions, those subtle everyday slights, being called, "Hello, princess," or being told she'd definitely need an epidural by a midwife she'd never even met.
And Tinu's experience, it's even more stark. Doctors refusing to examine her post-birth, just assuming a UTI, which led to immediate hospitalization, multiple blood transfusions. And her observation points to this awful assumption that Black women have a higher pain tolerance. These are grave institutional failures. They stem from deeply ingrained prejudices, stereotypes within medical training, within practice. Not necessarily a deliberate policy written down somewhere to harm Black women, but an egregious failure to overcome unconscious bias, a failure to ensure equitable care. The system's mechanisms are failing to protect people.
I hear an emphasis on historical biases and an institutional inertia, absolutely. But I still frame it differently, especially when we go back to things like the predictive policing algorithms. When these tools are built on data you know is historically biased data, reflecting past discrimination, and then they're actively deployed in a way that supercharges racism, as the research puts it, that feels like it transcends mere inertia or failure. It becomes a deliberate choice, doesn't it? A choice to use and maintain systems that predictably and actively harm specific communities. It's a decision to perpetuate, maybe even amplify, racial hierarchy through the very architecture of these systems. Whether that's direct intent or perhaps a willful negligence that reaches the level of intent because the consequences are so foreseeable and so devastating.
I'm still not entirely convinced by that interpretation of deliberate in every case. While the outcomes of predictive policing are, yes, undeniably discriminatory and the impact is profoundly harmful, deliberate usually implies an active, conscious, malicious intent right at the point of implementation or design. These algorithms, they often stem from unexamined historical biases just embedded within the data. coupled maybe with a real failure to critically interrogate how these tools will actually operate in diverse communities. It's a failure of oversight, sure. A failure of ethical design, absolutely. A failure to anticipate consequences. But is it always a malicious, proactive intent by every single system designer to entrench racism? I think it's often the profound lack of foresight, the unaddressed legacy of bias in the data itself that drives the problem, not necessarily a malevolent desire to harm in every instance.
Okay, but let me push back a bit there. At what point does that failure to interrogate, that failure to anticipate, that failure to correct known harms, at what point does that become a deliberate act of permission when the data clearly shows year after year that Black people are disproportionately stopped and searched by systems that are known to use biased algorithms? The continued deployment of those systems becomes a choice, doesn't it? And the government's treatment of the 2024 riots as merely violent disorder, its subsequent failure to address the underlying conditions, that feels like a deliberate minimizing of racial terrorism. This isn't just institutional inertia spinning its wheels. It feels like a conscious decision not to act, which in turn allows these discriminatory structures to persist and even, thrive. The system itself becomes complicit, making the outcomes deliberate by default, by its continued choices.
I understand your point about complicity through inaction. I really do. However, I'd argue there's still a crucial distinction, perhaps subtle but important, between that sort of passive complicity through inertia or incompetence and active malicious intent driving the whole system. The government's inaction, for example, could be interpreted as a profound institutional failure, maybe stemming from insufficient political will, maybe a lack of understanding of the deep racial dimensions of societal unrest, rather than a proactive, deliberate policy designed to entrench racism. If it were truly deliberate in every aspect, wouldn't we perhaps expect a clearer, more explicit legislative framework or policy framework actively aiming for discrimination? Instead, we often see this pattern of neglect and unintended consequences from systems that are simply not designed with racial equity as a primary, foundational concern from the outset.
The challenge here often seems to be the absence of effective countermeasures, the lack of accountability, which allows those existing biases to just keep going. And shifting back to the workplace and healthcare for a moment, it still seems to me that the experiences of Priya and Tinu, they really highlight the insidious role of ingrained stereotypes, individual biases that just permeate institutions, rather than the institution itself being designed top-down with a deliberate racist intent. Priya's thoughts being dismissed, being labeled a troublemaker, or he raw facing those microaggressions. That points to pervasive individual prejudices, yes, but also a glaring lack of accountability within the institutional structures. The systems are failing to mitigate these biases. The HR systems, for example, they aren't necessarily designed specifically to make Priya a troublemaker, but they are profoundly flawed when complaints are routinely ignored.
And that fosters a climate where these individual biases flourish, precisely because of that systemic inaction.
But I'm just not convinced that framing it primarily as individual biases lets the institution off the hook. When those individual biases are consistently ignored by management, like in Priya's case where nothing ever happens and she's the one labeled difficult for speaking up, or when Tinu is refused examination due to a widely known racist assumption about Black women's pain tolerance. This moves beyond just individual prejudice floating around. This becomes institutional sanctioning of racist behavior. The system's profound inaction, its failure to respond appropriately, effectively gives permission for these biases to operate freely, and that actively maintains a system structured around racial hierarchy. It's not just about the individual acts anymore. It's the institutional response, or the profound lack of one, that makes it systemic and effectively deliberate in its continuation of harm. When a manager, or a doctor, or whoever, chooses not to act on a report of discrimination or relies on a racist trope, that is a deliberate choice in that moment.
Okay, but to what extent is that choice driven by that individual's own bias versus, say, a larger structural weakness, or maybe a lack of training within the institution on how to effectively handle such complaints? Tinu's experience, for instance, it highlights a failure of medical training, right? And a professional culture that doesn't actively dismantle these deeply embedded stereotypes about pain tolerance. It's a critical error. It's a grave injustice, absolutely. But it's often born from this legacy of unexamined assumptions, a lack of specific, rigorous protocols to counteract them, rather than, say, a top-down explicit directive from the hospital trust to mistreat Black women. The outcome is the same, tragically, but understanding the root cause. Is it deliberate malice woven into the system's fabric, or is it profound failure and ingrained bias that needs rooting out? That really informs how we best intervene.
Do we focus on addressing malicious intent, or do we fundamentally need to rebuild flawed systems and training programs from the ground up?
Well, let's look at the external factors, too. The source highlights how something like Brexit unleashed a wave of xenophobia, didn't it? Resulting in those huge hate crime spikes, 29% in one year, another 19% the following year. This isn't just inertia. That feels like active political legitimation of certain attitudes. And furthermore, the online world becoming this battleground where racism flourishes with minimal consequence. 95% of Black and minority youth encountering violent racist content online.
95%. Yeah.
This indicates, to me, a deliberate shift or at least a deliberate acceptance within society and its structures where active, growing, and frankly emboldened racism is allowed to thrive. This isn't just about existing vulnerabilities being exploited. It feels like a societal and institutional environment that has, either by design or by deliberate neglect, become far more permissive of overt discrimination. When institutions fail to adequately regulate online hate, for example, they are in effect actively allowing it to proliferate. That's a choice.
I understand the argument that external factors like Brexit and the rise of online platforms definitely exacerbate tensions. They provide fertile ground. However, I think it's still crucial to distinguish between an unleashed wave of xenophobia, which implies something pre-existing breaking out, and a system deliberately designed from scratch today to be racist. The source itself notes that the roots of, say, Eastern European targeting were established long before Brexit gave it political legitimacy. So Brexit might have provided an opportunity, a sort of political legitimacy for those existing biases to surface more openly, but it didn't create the underlying prejudices out of thin air. Similarly, online platforms, while yes, undeniably failing, often miserably, to control hate speech, they may not have been deliberately built with the purpose of promoting racism. Rather, their issues often represent a massive failure of governance, a failure of regulation, a failure of corporate responsibility to adequately address these emerging, complex challenges. This feels more about an absence of effective countermeasures and these deep, unaddressed societal divisions being exploited by bad actors, rather than a conscious, deliberate, strategic move by the institutions themselves to promote racism as policy.
But surely, when those existing prejudices are given political legitimacy, whether intentionally or not, and when these incredibly powerful new digital tools allow for the widespread dissemination of hate with, as you say, minimal consequence, that is a societal and institutional shift. It takes the problem beyond just historical bias lingering. It's active enablement, isn't it? When the mechanisms that could intervene, regulatory bodies, platform moderation policies, government leadership, when they consistently fail to do so effectively, it becomes a choice to allow those conditions to persist and escalate. The sheer scale of hate crimes and online racism documented by Expert Treaty UK isn't just a reflection of unaddressed historical issues. It reflects an environment that is either actively cultivated or, at best, deliberately ignored, where racism is effectively empowered.
Empowered, yes, I agree with that. But often empowered by a lack of will, perhaps a lack of resources, or maybe just an inability of large, slow institutions to adapt to new challenges rapidly enough, rather than always stemming from a malevolent, deliberate intention at the core. For example, online platforms. They are genuinely struggling with the sheer volume and speed of content. Their failures, while devastating, often seem to stem from a reactive stance, a constant game of catch-up, and a struggle to build truly effective moderation at an unimaginable scale. Rather than an active desire to be a battleground for racism, we're talking about massive, complex systems that fail partly due to their inherent design limitations or the immense pressure of their global user base. definitely exacerbated by a lack of proactive, robust regulation. And the fact also mentioned in the research that young people are now more likely to call out discrimination, that also suggests a growing societal awareness and pushback against these biases, which might not be quite so visible if the discrimination was a fully top-down, deliberately mandated, and universally accepted norm.
Okay. Well, in light of our discussion, for me, the sheer volume and the systemic nature of the evidence we've touched on, from those starkly disproportionate hate crimes, the targeted use of automated racism and policing, through to what feels like sanctioned workplace discrimination through deliberate inaction, and the government's continued failure to properly address racialized violence, it still solidifies my conclusion. Racism in the UK in 2025 feels like it's not merely a collection of unfortunate incidents or just passive institutional failures drifting along. It feels deeply ingrained and demonstrably active in maintaining a racial hierarchy. And that makes it, for me, a deliberate feature of many institutional outcomes, whether that's by direct malicious design in some cases or by conscious willful neglect in others. The system's continued choices perpetuate the harm.
And I agree wholeheartedly on the devastating impact, the pervasive nature of racism across British society. The evidence is undeniable, the human cost immense. However, my perspective still holds that while the outcomes are indeed systemic, and they absolutely reinforce racial hierarchy, many of the specific issues we've discussed, housing disparities, those awful microaggressions, the biases in healthcare, can perhaps be more accurately understood as profound institutional failures and the persistent legacy of historical biases that consistently, damagingly go unaddressed. It's this inertia, this chronic lack of proactive change, the lack of accountability, that perpetuates the crisis. It makes it a deeply complex problem, one that demands more than just identifying individual bad acts, but really requires a wholesale reckoning with how our systems operate, how they are structured, and how they fundamentally fail time and again to create truly equitable outcomes for everyone.
We truly hope this discussion has perhaps illuminated some of the complexities surrounding racism in the UK today, maybe offering different lenses through which to understand its nature and its persistence.
Yes, and we strongly encourage you to delve deeper into the invaluable and extensive research provided by Expert Trader UK. It formed the bedrock of our conversation today, and honestly, there is so much more to explore within that critical material.
Thank you for joining us on The Debate. If you found this discussion thought-provoking, perhaps challenging, please do take a moment to like and subscribe for more content like this.
And we always welcome your own perspectives on these vital issues. Please share them. Thank you for listening.